The shrill ring of the doorbell pierced the silence of my grief like a knife. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Elizabeth, my mother-in-law, stood there with her lips pursed and eyes narrowed. It had only been 3 days since we buried Mark, and already she was here to disrupt what little peace I'd managed to find. "Clara," she said, her voice as cold as the autumn air that swept in behind her. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "Of course not, Elizabeth. Please come in." She strode past me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors Mark and I had chosen together. I followed her into the living room, where she perched on the edge of the sofa, her back ramrod straight. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," Elizabeth said, her gaze sweeping critically over the room. I sank into Mark's favorite armchair, running my fingers over the worn fabric. "I assumed you wanted to check on me. It's been a difficult few days." Elizabeth's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, my dear, I'm not here to coddle you. I'm here to discuss the house." My heart skipped a beat. "The house? What about it?" "Well, now that Mark is gone, we need to sort out the living arrangements. After all, this house belongs to the family." I frowned, confusion settling over me like a heavy blanket. "I'm not sure I understand. Mark and I bought this house together. We built our life here." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes glinting. "That's where you're mistaken, Clara. The house was left solely to Mark, not to you. Didn't he tell you?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "That's impossible. We saved for years to buy this place. We picked out every fixture, every paint color together." "Oh, you poor, naive girl," Elizabeth said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Mark may have let you believe that, but the truth is, this house has always been in the family. His father left it to him in his will." I shook my head, struggling to process her words. "No, that can't be right. Mark would have told me." Elizabeth stood, smoothing her skirt. "Well, he didn't. And now that he's gone, we need to discuss your living situation. After all, you're not really family anymore, are you?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. I rose to my feet, anger burning through the fog of my grief. "How dare you? I was Mark's wife. I cared for him after his accident. I gave up everything for him." "And now he's gone," Elizabeth said, her voice flat. "Your duty is done. It's time for you to move on." I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my voice steady. "This is my home, Elizabeth. I'm not going anywhere." She moved towards the door, pausing to look back at me. "We'll see about that, Clara. I suggest you start packing. You'll be hearing from our lawyer soon." The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the sudden silence. I sank back into Mark's chair, my mind reeling. How could this be happening? How could Mark have kept such a secret from me? I glanced around the room, taking in the photos on the mantel, the throw pillows I'd embroidered myself, the bookshelves Mark and I had filled together. This was our home, our life. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was all slipping away. As the reality of my situation began to sink in, I felt a resolve hardening within me. I wouldn't let Elizabeth bully me out of my own home. I wouldn't let her tarnish the memory of the life Mark and I had built together. I reached for the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. "Aunt Martha? It's Clara. I need your help. You won't believe what Elizabeth just told me." I closed my eyes, letting the warm sunlight wash over me as I sat on the porch swing. The gentle creaking of the chains transported me back to happier times, when Mark and I would spend lazy Sunday afternoons out here, dreaming of our future. "Clara, honey?" Mark's voice echoed from inside the house. "Can you come here for a sec?" I found him in the kitchen, surrounded by paint swatches and flooring samples. His eyes lit up as I entered, and he pulled me close for a kiss. "What do you think about this color for the living room?" he asked, holding up a soft sage-green swatch. I wrinkled my nose. "A bit too earthy, don't you think?" Mark laughed, the sound warming me from the inside out. "You're right. How about this blue instead?" As we pored over the samples, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Elizabeth standing there, her face drawn and tired. "Elizabeth," I said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" She stepped inside, her eyes darting around nervously. I need to talk to Mark." Mark appeared behind me, his hand resting on my lower back. "Mom, what's going on?" Elizabeth's chin quivered. "Your father, he's gone, heart attack. I don't know what to do." The next few weeks passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and legal meetings. As we sat in the lawyer's office, listening to the reading of Mark's father's will, I felt a growing unease. "And to my son, Mark, I leave the family home," the lawyer droned on. I turned to Mark, confusion etched on my face. "I thought we were buying this house together?" Before Mark could respond, Elizabeth cut in. "Of course you are, dear. This is just a formality. The house has always been in the family." Mark squeezed my hand reassuringly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I broached the subject again. "Mark, about the house." He sighed, pulling me closer. "I know I should have told you, but it doesn't change anything. This is our home, Clara. We've put our heart and soul into it." I wanted to believe him, but a seed of doubt had been planted. The following week, Elizabeth showed up on our doorstep, suitcases in tow. "I hope you don't mind," she said, brushing past me. "I just can't bear to be alone in that big empty house." Mark and I exchanged glances. "Of course not, Mom," he said. "Stay as long as you need." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Elizabeth's presence began to wear on me. She critiqued my cooking, rearranged our furniture, and constantly reminded me of my shortcomings as a wife and homemaker. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Elizabeth cornered me in the kitchen. "You know, Clara," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "I've been thinking. Perhaps it would be best if I just moved in permanently. After all, this is my family home." I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. "Elizabeth, Mark and I are starting our own family. We need our space." Her eyes narrowed. "Space? In my son's house? I think you're forgetting your place here, Clara." Before I could respond, Mark walked in. "Everything okay in here?" Elizabeth's demeanor changed instantly. "Of course, darling. I was just offering to help Clara with dinner. She seems a bit overwhelmed." As Elizabeth brushed past us, Mark turned to me. "You okay? You look upset." I wanted to tell him everything, to make him understand how his mother's presence was slowly suffocating me. But the words caught in my throat. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." Mark kissed my forehead. "Why don't you go rest? I'll finish up here." As I climbed the stairs, I heard Elizabeth's voice drift up from the kitchen. "Mark, darling, we need to talk about Clara. I'm worried she's not cut out for this family." I paused, my heart pounding. What was Elizabeth up to? And more importantly, how would Mark respond? As I stood there, frozen on the stairs, I realized that the battle for my home and my marriage had only just begun. The screech of tires and the sickening crunch of metal tore through my world like a hurricane. One moment, Mark and I were laughing about some silly joke, and the next, our lives changed forever. I paced the sterile hospital corridor, my heart pounding in my ears. The doctor's words echoed in my mind: paralyzed from the waist down, extensive rehabilitation, full-time care. Elizabeth burst through the doors, her face a mask of fury. "Where is he? What happened?" I tried to explain, but she brushed past me into Mark's room. I followed, feeling like an intruder in my own husband's space. "Oh, my poor baby," Elizabeth cooed, stroking Mark's hair. She turned to me, eyes blazing. "How could you let this happen?" Mark's weak voice cut through the tension. "Mom, it wasn't Clara's fault, please." Weeks turned into months, and our once peaceful home became a battleground. I resigned from my job to care for Mark full-time, learning to navigate the complexities of his new needs. One afternoon, as I was helping Mark with his exercises, Elizabeth barged in. "Clara, the house is a mess. When was the last time you dusted?" I bit back a retort, focusing on Mark's movements. "I've been a little busy, Elizabeth," she sniffed disapprovingly. "Well, if you can't handle it, perhaps we should hire a housekeeper. Of course, that would mean even less money coming in." Mark's face flushed with anger. "Mom, that's enough. Clara's doing her best." I squeezed his hand gratefully, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. "And what about your writing, Clara? Surely you could be doing that instead of whatever it is you do all day." That night, after Mark was asleep, I sat at my desk, staring at the blank computer screen. Elizabeth's words echoed in my mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe I could be doing more. I started writing, pouring my fears and frustrations onto the page. Before I knew it, the sun was peeking through the curtains, and I had the rough draft of a short story. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a new routine. Caring for Mark during the day, writing late into the night. It wasn't easy, but it gave me a sense of purpose beyond caregiving. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Elizabeth cornered me in the kitchen. I saw your name in that little online magazine," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is that what you've been doing instead of keeping this house in order?" I took a deep breath, determined not to let her get to me. "I'm trying to contribute, Elizabeth. Writing helps pay the bills." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Contribute? Please, those pennies you earn are nothing compared to what Mark used to make. Face it, Clara, you're a burden on this family." Something inside me snapped. "A burden? I've given up everything to care for your son. I'm doing my best to keep this family afloat while you do nothing but criticize." Elizabeth's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" "Your home?" I shot back. "Mark and I built this life together. You're the guest here, Elizabeth." The sound of Mark's wheelchair interrupted our argument. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Elizabeth's demeanor changed instantly. "Nothing, darling. Clara and I were just discussing household matters." I turned away, unable to bear the look of confusion on Mark's face. As I busied myself at the stove, I heard Elizabeth's voice, low and menacing. "This isn't over, Clara. You may have Mark fooled, but I see right through you. One way or another, I'll make sure you know your place in this family." As she swept out of the kitchen, I gripped the counter, my knuckles turning white. I knew then that this was more than just a clash of personalities. Elizabeth saw me as a threat, and she wouldn't rest until she had pushed me out of Mark's life, and out of this house for good. I looked at Mark, his worried eyes meeting mine, and made a silent vow. I wouldn't let Elizabeth win. No matter what it took, I would fight for my marriage, my home, and the life Mark and I had built together. The shrill ring of my phone jolted me awake. I fumbled for it in the darkness, my heart racing. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice thick with sleep. "Clara, it's Dr. Patel. You need to come to the hospital right away. It's Mark." The world tilted on its axis as I rushed to dress. My hands shook so badly I could barely button my blouse. I called Elizabeth, leaving a terse voicemail about Mark's condition before racing to the car. The hospital corridors seemed endless as I ran towards Mark's room. Dr. Patel met me outside, his face grave. "I'm sorry, Clara. We did everything we could, but the infection was too severe. Mark passed away a few minutes ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered, bracing myself against the wall. "No," I whispered. "No, it can't be." I don't remember entering Mark's room, but suddenly I was there, clutching his lifeless hand. His skin was still warm, and for a moment I could almost pretend he was just sleeping. But the stillness in his chest told the truth my heart couldn't accept. "Mark," I sobbed, pressing my forehead to his. "Please, don't leave me." A commotion in the hallway broke through my grief. Elizabeth's voice, shrill and angry, echoed off the walls. "Where is he? Where's my son?" She burst into the room, her eyes wild. When she saw Mark, she let out a wail that chilled me to the bone. "My baby! Oh, my poor baby!" Elizabeth threw herself across Mark's body, pushing me aside. I stumbled back, watching in stunned silence as she stroked his face, murmuring words I couldn't understand. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, well-meaning visitors. I moved through it all in a fog, barely registering the words of sympathy or the gentle touches on my arm. Elizabeth took charge, making decisions about the service and the burial without consulting me. I was too numb to protest. It wasn't until the night after the funeral that reality truly set in. I sat in Mark's favorite chair, clutching one of his sweaters to my chest, when Elizabeth entered the room. "Well," she said, her voice oddly calm, "I suppose we need to discuss what happens now." I looked up at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth sighed, settling herself on the sofa. "Clara, dear, you have to understand. With Mark gone, things have to change. This house, it's been in our family for generations. It was never really yours." Her words pierced through my grief like a knife. "What are you saying, Elizabeth?" "I'm saying that it's time for you to move on, find a place of your own, start a new life." I stood up, anger finally breaking through my numbness. "This is my home. Mark and I built our life here together." Elizabeth's eyes hardened. "No, Clara, this was Mark's home. You were just a guest here, and now your stay has come to an end." "You can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "Mark wouldn't want this." "Mark isn't here anymore," Elizabeth snapped, "and I'm the one who decides what happens to this house now." As the full weight of her words sank in, I felt something inside me break. Not only had I lost my husband, but now I was losing my home, my security, everything we had built together. I turned away from Elizabeth, unable to bear the triumphant gleam in her eyes. My gaze fell on a photo of Mark and me on our wedding day, smiling and full of hope for the future. A future that now lay in ashes at my feet. In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could fight Elizabeth, drag this out in a bitter legal battle that would tarnish Mark's memory. Or I could find the strength to start anew, to honor Mark by living the life he would have wanted for me. As I stood there, torn between grief and determination, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. And somehow, I would have to find the courage to face it alone. I sat on the floor of Mark's study, surrounded by photo albums and memories. My fingers traced the outline of his face in our wedding photo, tears blurring my vision. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral, and the house felt emptier than ever. The creak of the door startled me. Elizabeth stood there, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Still wallowing, I see," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I wiped my eyes, struggling to my feet. "I'm just remembering," I said softly. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Remembering? Or plotting?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, confusion mixing with my grief. She struck into the room, snatching the photo album from my hands. "Don't play innocent with me, Clara. I know what you're up to." "Elizabeth, please. I don't understand." "Oh, spare me," she spat. "You think if you play the grieving widow long enough, you'll get to keep this house? Well, let me tell you something. This house belongs to the family. To me, you're nothing but a guest here, and your welcome has long overstayed." Her words hit me like a physical blow. "How can you say that? Mark and I built our life here together. This is my home, too." Elizabeth laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Your home? You really are delusional, aren't you? Mark may have let you believe that, but the truth is, you were never more than a temporary fixture in his life. In our family." I felt something snap inside me. That's not true. Mark loved me. We were partners in everything. "Partners?" Elizabeth scoffed. "Is that what you call it when you couldn't even give him children? When you quit your job and became a burden? Face it, Clara, you were never good enough for my son." Her words cut deep, reopening wounds I thought had long since healed. "I took care of Mark," I said, my voice shaking. "I was there for him when he needed me most." Elizabeth's face contorted with rage. "And where were you when he died? Off scribbling your little stories while my son took his last breath alone." The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of Mark's desk for support. "That's not... I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Elizabeth sneered. "You were too wrapped up in your own little world to notice my son slipping away. Some wife you were." Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to breathe. "Elizabeth, please, this isn't what Mark would have wanted. Don't you dare presume to know what my son would have wanted," she hissed. "Mark is gone, and it's time you accepted that. This charade of yours ends now. I want you out of this house by the end of the week." "You can't do this," I whispered, my mind reeling. "This is my home." Elizabeth's eyes glittered with malice. "Watch me. If you're not gone by Friday, I'll have the locks changed and your things thrown out on the street. It's time you faced reality, Clara. You're not family. You never were." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my life. I sank to the floor, sobs racking my body as the full weight of my situation crashed down on me. I was alone, truly, completely alone. The home I had shared with Mark, the life we had built together, was being ripped away from me. And the worst part was, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe Elizabeth was right. Maybe I hadn't been enough for Mark. Maybe I didn't deserve this home, these memories. As the sun set outside the window, casting long shadows across the room, I knew I had a decision to make. I could fight Elizabeth, cling to the remnants of my life with Mark, or I could find the strength to start anew. With trembling hands, I reached for the photo album, opening it to the last picture Mark and I had taken together. His smile, so full of love and life, seemed to give me strength. I traced his face one last time, then slowly closed the book. It was time to write a new chapter in my story, even if it meant leaving behind everything I had ever known. I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I clutched a mug of cold coffee. Elizabeth's ultimatum echoed in my mind: leave by Friday or be thrown out. I had less than 48 hours to decide my fate. The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. I opened it to find my Aunt Martha, her kind face creased with concern. "Clara, honey," she said, pulling me into a hug. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay?" I broke down in her arms, weeks of pent-up grief and frustration pouring out. Between sobs, I told her everything. Elizabeth's cruelty, the threat of eviction, my fear of losing the last connection to Mark. Martha listened, her eyes growing harder with each word. When I finished, she took my hands in hers. "Clara, you need to fight this. That house is as much yours as it is Elizabeth's." I shook my head. "I can't, Martha. I'm so tired of fighting. Maybe it's time I let go." "Let go?" Martha's voice rose. "Clara, this isn't just about a house. It's about your life with Mark, your memories, your future. You can't let Elizabeth bully you out of that." As if summoned by her name, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of disdain. "Well, if it isn't the cavalry," she sneered, "come to talk some sense into her?" Martha stood, drawing herself up to her full height. "I've come to support my niece, Elizabeth, something you seem incapable of doing for your own daughter-in-law." Elizabeth's eyes flashed. "Daughter-in-law? Please." Clara was nothing more than a temporary distraction for Mark. Now that he's gone, it's time for her to move on. I flinched at her words, but Martha wasn't backing down. "How dare you? Clara was Mark's wife, his partner. She has every right to be here." "Rights?" Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "The only rights here are mine. This house belongs to me now, and I want her out." Something snapped inside me. I stepped forward, my voice steadier than I felt. "No, Elizabeth. This house was Mark's, and he wanted me to have it. I'm not leaving." Elizabeth's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" She lunged forward, her hand raised as if strike me. Martha intercepted, grabbing Elizabeth's wrist. "That's enough, Clara. Go pack a bag. You're coming with me." "But—" I started to protest. "Now, Clara," Martha insisted. "We need to talk to a lawyer." As I hurried upstairs, I heard Elizabeth's shrill voice. "A lawyer? Go ahead, you'll see. I'll make sure she has nothing left when I'm done." My hands trembled as I threw clothes into a suitcase. This was it, the moment everything changed. I was leaving the home Mark and I had shared, possibly for the last time. As I zipped the bag closed, my gaze fell on our wedding photo on the nightstand. Mark's smile, so full of love and hope, seemed to give me strength. I picked up the frame, clutching it to my chest. "I'm sorry, Mark," I whispered. "I tried to hold on, but I don't know if I can anymore." Downstairs, Martha was waiting by the door, her face grim. "Come on, honey. We'll figure this out." As we stepped outside, Elizabeth's voice rang out behind us. "Don't bother coming back, Clara. Next time I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet street. I stumbled, overwhelmed by the finality of it all. Martha steadied me, her arm around my shoulders. "It's not over, Clara. We'll fight this, I promise." As we drove away, I watched the house, my home, grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The life I had known, the future Mark and I had planned, seemed to be slipping away with each passing mile. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. In that moment, I felt more alone than ever before. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with legal battles and emotional turmoil. But as the car carried me away from everything I had ever known, I realized that this might be my last chance to reclaim not just my home, but my very identity. The question was, did I have the strength to fight for it? The keys to my new apartment felt cold and unfamiliar in my hand as I unlocked the door. The small, one-bedroom space was a far cry from the home I'd shared with Mark, but it was mine. No Elizabeth, no painful memories lurking around every corner. I set down the last of my boxes and surveyed my new kingdom. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it held the promise of a fresh start. I could almost hear Mark's voice encouraging me. "You've got this, Clara. Time to write your own story." With a deep breath, I unpacked my laptop and set it on the rickety kitchen table. It was time to get back to work, to lose myself in the worlds I created on the page. As I began to type, the words flowed more freely than they had in months. Hours passed, and I barely noticed the sun setting outside my window. I was deep in the throes of writing when my phone buzzed, startling me. Elizabeth's name flashed on the screen. My finger hovered over the decline button, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I answered, my voice wary. "Clara?" Elizabeth's voice sounded strained, almost panicked. I need your help." I sat back, stunned. My help? With what? "The house," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "There's so much to manage. The taxes, the repairs. I don't know how you and Mark did it all." A bitter laugh escaped me. "We managed it together, Elizabeth, something you never understood." "Please," she begged. "I don't know who else to turn to. You know this house better than anyone." For a moment, I was tempted. The thought of being back in my home, surrounded by the life Mark and I had built, was almost overwhelming. But then I remembered Elizabeth's cruel words, the way she'd thrown me out without a second thought. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," I said, my voice firm. "But that's not my problem anymore. You wanted the house, and now it's yours to deal with." But I cut her off. "No, Elizabeth, you made your choice. Now you have to live with it." I ended the call, my hand shaking. Part of me felt guilty for turning her away, but a larger part felt liberated. For the first time since Mark's death, I'd stood up for myself, set a boundary. Energized, I turned back to my writing. The words flowed even faster now, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose. I was no longer just Clara, Mark's widow. I was Clara, the writer, forging her own path. Days turned into weeks, and I fell into a routine. Write, submit, repeat. The rejections stung, but each one only made me more determined. And then, finally, an acceptance. A small literary magazine wanted to publish one of my short stories. As I celebrated with a glass of wine, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Martha. "Clara, honey," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Have you spoken to Elizabeth recently?" I sighed. "She called a few weeks ago, asking for help with the house. I told her no." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Well, it seems she's in over her head. The neighbors called me. Apparently the house is falling into disrepair. Elizabeth can't keep up with it." A pang of guilt shot through me. "That's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility anymore, Martha." "I know, dear," Martha said softly, "but, well, there's more. Elizabeth is talking about selling the house." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Selling? But that's our home. Mark's home." "I know," Martha replied. "I thought you should know, in case you wanted to do something about it." As I hung up the phone, I felt as if I was standing on the edge of a precipice. On one side was the new life I'd begun to build, free from Elizabeth's toxicity. On the other, the home filled with memories of Mark, the life we'd shared. I glanced at my laptop, at the story I'd just sold, then at the photo of Mark on my desk. His smile seemed to challenge me, asking what I was going to do next. In that moment, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. The question was, did I have the strength to fight for my past while still moving towards my future? The doorbell's chime echoed through my apartment, jolting me from my writing trance. I opened the door to find Aunt Martha, her face etched with concern. "Clara, honey," she said, stepping inside. "We need to talk about Elizabeth." My stomach clenched. "What's she done now?" Martha sighed, settling onto my worn sofa. "It's not what she's done. It's what she's lost. The house, Clara. She sold it." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "Sold it? But how? When?" "Last week," Martha replied. "For a fraction of its worth, too. She didn't know the first thing about real estate." I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. "What about the car? Mark's things?" Martha's eyes filled with pity. "Gone. All of it. She sold everything she could and gambled away the rest." A sob caught in my throat. "But why? How could she do that?" "Oh, honey," Martha said softly, "Elizabeth never knew how to manage on her own. Without Mark, without you, she was lost." The irony of it all hit me like a tidal wave. Elizabeth, who had been so determined to push me out, had ended up losing everything herself. "Where is she now?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Martha shook her head. "That's the thing. No one knows. She's burned bridges with every family member who tried to help. Last I heard, she was staying at a motel on the edge of town." I stood up, pacing the small room. I should feel satisfied, shouldn't I? After everything she put me through, this feels like justice. "But you don't, do you?" Martha asked gently. I stopped, staring out the window at the city below. "No," I whispered. "I feel sad. For her, for Mark, for the life we all could have had if things had been different." Martha joined me at the window, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have a good heart, Clara. That's why Mark loved you so much." Her words sparked something in me. I turned to face her, a new resolve burning in my chest. "I need to see her, Martha. One last time." The motel was as dingy as I'd imagined. I knocked on room 13, my heart pounding. When the door opened, I barely recognized the woman before me. Elizabeth, once so proud and put together, looked haggard and defeated. "Clara," she croaked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Hello, Elizabeth," I said softly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, wordlessly. The room was a mess, clothes strewn about, empty bottles littering every surface. "Why are you here?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath. "Because despite everything, you're family. And I think Mark would have wanted me to check on you." At the mention of Mark's name, Elizabeth crumpled. Sobs racked her body as years of grief and bitterness poured out. I hesitated for a moment before wrapping my arms around her, my own tears falling freely. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, two women united in loss and regret. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back, looking Elizabeth in the eye. "It's time to start over," I said firmly. "Both of us." Elizabeth nodded, a glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. "But how? I've lost everything." I smiled, a plan forming in my mind. "Not everything. You still have family, Elizabeth, and I think I might have an idea." As we left the motel room together, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The house was gone, along with many of the physical reminders of my life with Mark. But I realized that the most important things, the memories, the love, the lessons learned, were still with me. I glanced at Elizabeth, seeing her not as an enemy, but as a fellow traveler on this journey of grief and healing. We had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months I felt truly hopeful. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than she had been before. I smiled, hearing Mark's voice in my head. "That's my girl. Keep writing your story, Clara. The best chapters are yet to come." And as the sun set on this chapter of my life, I knew that he was right. The end of one story was just the beginning of another, and this time I was ready to be the author of my own tale.